Day 3 with Russell Brand. See it first on Rumble. But on one hand, what we're saying is that it don't look good flying about in private jets, talking about your carbon footprint when it's like the BFG's giant sandals banging down on the mountain sides up there in the snow. But perhaps significant, and also that it's yet another one of these unelected globalist bodies where they preach in rarefied air about matters that will affect the lives of ordinary people and things that won't directly affect them because they're able to protect themselves from that through wealth. But the area that perhaps interests me most, James, is the actual policies that are conceived, discussed and popularised through the discourse at Davos that end up being implemented through governments. And you think that digitisation and CBDCs, which I always nearly say CBBBs, don't know how, it's just so difficult because CBBBs, if you're a British person, is a very good children's TV scheduling section. So, mate, what in particular around the pandemic and digitisation and digital IDs did we see, as you say, come down the tracks, move from something being discussed to being implemented?
If you look back historically with the WEF and some of the things they're putting out on social media, but also some of their agenda papers and so on, they were talking about this stuff quite a few years ago, but it really wasn't getting that much.
Really?
Yeah.
I mean, they were talking about we've all got our digital IDs.
Well, they were nudging.
And were they talking about pandemics as well?
Well, they weren't saying so much that everyone's got to be in digitalised, but they were saying there's aspects of digital ID that's coming down the tracks. They were talking about net zero responses. They're talking about globalised response for future emergencies through healthcare and so on. And so people have gone through their back catalogue in sort of real time now. So, well, actually, that's where they were nudging the agenda. But I think one of the key things at the moment is if you look at, say, the pandemic response, there's almost two stages. First of all, there was a lockdown stage, and then it went into forms of digitalisation, in particular vaccine passports. Which, for me, I had a massive problem with that. I think it was illiberal, it was unethical. There isn't actually a justifiable argument for something like that.
I'll just point out that we're still on YouTube, and YouTube is governed by the WHO's policies when it comes to discussing those medications. And if you could just bear that in mind, later on Rumble, we'll be able to talk without bearing in mind the WHO, another unelected body, funded in part by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. I'll point out, I think I can say that on YouTube. So just want to be careful. Remember to stay with us on Rumble when we come off YouTube. It's very important that you do that. Very important you do that. Please continue, James.
So I think in terms of digitalisation, we're now heading at a stage where if you look at all the different aspects of emergency response and also the issues that the WEF and governments and also corporations are moving towards, whether it's on net zero, whether it's to do with pandemic response, whether it's to do with financial, it looks like we're heading toward aspects of digitalisation control. Central bank digital currency is a perfect example of that. In fact, the UK government produced their consultation document last week to talk about digital ID. Now, these are things...
Did they?
Yeah, it came out on the 4th of January. I mean, this is something that's been coming down the tracks, and Sunak's been talking about central bank digital currencies for quite some time. He did it when he was Chancellor.
I've seen him talking about that. I've seen him talking to camera, like when he does that thing where he don't look like he knows where he's looking properly. And saying like digital currencies
we all have moments of that. I'm getting that here. We all have moments of that. But I think what's happened with the WEF, they were talking about a lot of these issues quite a few years ago. So you end up having a global response to the pandemic, which ends up with aspects of increased digital ID. And then you end up having these functions, not just at the WEF, but also things like COP and also things like the G20 and the G7, where they're talking about globalized coordination, agendas, and you're talking about potential treaties coming down the track, and then you're getting individual governments are putting consultation exercises for digital ID. People look at, well, who are the conduits of this? Who are nudging us towards this? We know the WEF, they haven't got any sort of legitimacy and authority in terms of legislation, but they have been talking about this for quite some time. They're nudging governments in a particular direction. You have a bunch of young leaders of the WEF who are now, as Klaus Schwab said, penetrating government. And you end up with a situation where people start asking a lot of questions and people start getting very suspicious about this. This is not some sort of conspiracy theory when you end up having governments doing consultation exercises and also pilot schemes for something like central bank digital currency or other forms of digital ID, when you end up having things like vaccine passports through the pandemic. And so people end up taking a step and go, well, how did this actually begin? What organizations were talking about this before? The WEF is one of those organizations.
So in a sense, it's sort of like they provide lubrication for ideas to enter into the mainstream and help to house and frame these notions. A couple of good examples that you've just explained for us, James. digital IDs, which was for a long time in British politics, particularly, people have talked about that and rejected it. But so the WEF at best are a soft sell for a globalist agenda and soft influence rather than direct political power, because they're of course unelected.
I suppose you could also say, Ross, is that the pandemic was a way in which these ideas were utilised and brought into the kind of mainstream ideas, because when you're saying things like digital passports and people are broadly agreeing with them because of health reasons, maybe 10, 20 years ago when Tony Blair was bringing in the idea of IDs, national IDs, people were rejecting them.
Because there's no reason for it. So
right, wasn't the virtue to create this?
Well, this is, I suppose, one of the concerns is that if you have a particular agenda, then perhaps, and this is for you to let me know in the chat, let me know in the comments, do you imagine that they favour conditions, circumstances and crises that legitimise the implementation of an agenda that they already had? Stay free with Russell Brand. See it first on Rumble.